like that. Things like guidelines regarding employment would be like what? How many hours, can someone work, right? What is the legal number of hours, maximum number of hours somebody can work? What is the minimum wage that can be paid out? What is the minimum age, right? That you can employ somebody and so on, right? Okay, so what things relating to protection of labor, for instance, right? Like protection against employment, right? Discrimination based on race. What am I saying? Based on age and race, ethnicity, religion, right? Anything that relating to guidelines, on employment and so on, right? Okay, right. Bureaucratic red tape. I don't think bureaucratic red tape. I would say maybe bureaucratic red tape is more associated with things like maybe the standards, like environmental standards, or related to technical standards, right? Because you have to achieve particular standards. You have to apply for all of these accreditation and so on. So maybe that's where the red tape would come in, rain, right? That would be where I would link that idea to, right? Anything that's to do with health and safety standards or environmental standards, right? Is also very costly, right? Because say for example, payment of carbon tax or green tax, changing the way you produce, right? In order to abide by these health and safety standards and environmental standards and so on. So that's what basically market regulation is about. Hold on to this idea because we will look at this again when we see literally the last 2 to 3 slides of this lecture, when we look at the varieties of capitalism in command market in command market economies and labor market economies, LME and CMEs, right? We'll come back to this subsequently. Then we also want to focus, which is the main focus for today, right, is the logic of public spending policies, right, which is what has been identified by Musgrave, right? So there are basically 3 different categories. You've got allocation, redistribution, and macroeconomic stabilization. Okay, let's look at them specifically. All right, all of these 3 are related to public spending. It's just how we have broken them down. This one is an important point, right? This has to do with the definitions. So please put an asterisk on this slide or highlight, whatever it is, right? Please draw your attention to this slide, right? That it is important when you start to talk about public spending and the types of public spending. There are different categories of public spending that create different outcomes. That's the main idea, right, behind distinguishing the different types of public spending policies. You understand? Okay? All right. So what you want to focus on, right, is the meaning associated with each of these types of public spending policies and what are the various outcomes. So if you look at allocation, right, so any kind of policy that is associated with allocation basically are policies, right, related to public spending on public goods that bring about broad benefits to society, right? So when you talk about public goods, right, what are your typical examples of public goods? Anything that relates to public goods and services, right? So things like healthcare, public healthcare, right? Things like public education. Notice, we didn't say healthcare. We made a distinction and we were clear about referring to it as public healthcare, right? Because healthcare is an industry, right? It can be provided privately and it can be provided publicly as well. But if you refer specifically to public spending and allocation, then you want to zoom in on the idea that it's public healthcare. These small things make a difference, right? Because if you get a marker, right, that is zooming in on these ideas, right, they will point out, but healthcare can be provided publicly or it can be provided privately as well, right? So you want to make sure that you indicate all of these things specifically in your exam answer, right? Okay. So the rationale is that when you look at, say for example, national defense or public healthcare, public education, what you're looking at is to improve, right, society in general, right? And the logic is that these kinds of things technically should not be provided by the market. Why? It should not be provided by the market. Technically, public goods and services, right? Why is it not good for the market to provide it? And why is it that the government must step in? Yeah, just go ahead. Because it's needs. Okay, so what? Okay. Yes. You're basically excluding groups of people from accessing healthcare, right? Why? Because the motivation of markets and private businesses is profit maximization, correct? So that is why we mentioned, right? That, yeah, correct, right? Okay, so that is why we mentioned the idea of what? What we mentioning the idea that it is not provided at a sufficient level, right? Because it excludes, right, groups of people who cannot afford it or cannot access it, right? So it's not provided at a sufficient level by the market, right? And that is why the government basically steps in, right? Okay. Yeah, focus on profit, do not treat patients. Yeah, so that's the main idea down here, the focus on profit. Private businesses, how they focus on profit, right? Then we make a distinction between allocate. So we understand what allocation refers to, okay, public goods and services, typical examples, right? So that's what is indicated on the last column on the right, right? Then we look specifically at the idea of redistribution, all right? And for, before we go on to the next slide, we must have an adequate understanding of the differences between the two, right? So redistribution, what does redistribution focuses on, right? The most important point in the idea of redistribution, it is not distribution, it is redistribution, meaning you are taking something and you are changing the way it is distributed in society. That's the layman understanding of redistribution, right? So what it does is that it deliberately reallocates resources in society, right? So what I'm doing is that I deliberately take this X amount of money, right, that may have otherwise, if I didn't redistribute it, right, it would have been distributed in a particular way. But now I want to create a particular outcome. I have a goal in mind, right? I as government have a goal in mind, right? And in doing so, what am I achieving? What am I trying to achieve? The particular outcome is that I want to ensure, right, that those that are at maybe the lower strata of the income, lower level of the income strata are able to access certain public goods and services. They're able to access purchase of goods. They're able to have access to better standards of living and so on, right? So what am I doing is that I am actually creating winners and losers rather than think about bringing about broad benefits to society. I'm zooming in on particular elements of society, right, that require this extra help, this leg up, right? So this is where we get the idea, right, that there are no broad benefits for society as a whole, but those that, okay, the very famous phrase that they like to use, the haves and the have-nots, right? Okay, which I don't really like. But the idea is that, right, you are actually attempting to reallocate resources in society in such a way, right, that you are enhancing the ability of those that are in the lower strata that may not necessarily have access to these goods and services, and you're trying to create some kind of leveling up, or you're trying to create some kind of leveling the playing field within society. And that's where you get the idea of welfare benefits. Get how do you create welfare benefits or unemployment benefits or pensions and so on? How does government fund them? How does government fund them? Yeah, taxes, right? And what is the idea behind taxation? What is the idea behind taxation? Taxation is revenue for government. Am I right? Okay, so you take from the people who are employed, you take from the people who are earning at a higher income bracket, right? That's what progressive taxation is about. The more you earn, right, the higher you are taxed according, to the particular structure of that economy, right? And what does that do? What does that do? I pay the taxes. Where does my taxes go to? It goes to fund these public programs. It goes to fund welfare programs. It goes to fund benefits. It goes to fund your pensions for those people who require that, correct? So in this case, who is the winner and who is the loser? Yeah, just go ahead. Who's the winner and who's the loser? yeah, the ones who pay the taxes, right, to fund these programs, who are considered to be the income earners, right, they are technically considered to be the loser, right, and the winners are those who receive these benefits, right? Okay. Um, okay, I'm not going to go into that question about the world's richest don't pay taxes because that is a different argument altogether, right? But that depends. I would say that that contributes to a specific, structure. It depends also on the way that the incumbent governments or the political parties have structured it in such a way. Who are they? Which constituents are they interested in benefiting? Right? Okay, so that is why you see certain political parties that champion a particular tax structure, whereas others champion another kind of tax structure. Right? Okay, so that is basically the idea. Sorry, Iyad's a question. Allocation of public healthcare, public education is also leveling up the lower strata of society. Okay, so the rationale here, Iyad's question, right? The rationale between the two is that public healthcare basically is something that basically everyone has got access to, right? Does everyone have access to welfare benefits? Like if you are if you are in a particular income bracket, would you qualify for a particular welfare benefit, or would you qualify for an unemployment benefit? No, right? Technically, right? Like say for example, when you want to, like in Singapore, you have that the CHAS medical system, right? And then even with that CHAS medical system, I think there are different categories, right? Say for example, also if you look at the GST rebates and the payouts that people have been experiencing in the last couple of years, right? Then even that is calculated according to what kind of income bracket you experience, like the whole total household income, or even what housing you live in. They forget people who bought the condos, right? Maybe they spend all their money on the condo and then they have no money otherwise to spend on other things. So the rationale is that okay, if you stay in a particular type of housing, you may not necessarily be eligible for some of these, right? So that is the main difference. You understand the difference between the two, right? But public healthcare, whether say for let's use public education for example, whether you come from a particular income bracket or what kind of housing you come from doesn't really impact on the fact when you go to say a public educational institution, right? Say if you go to a public university or you go to a primary school or a secondary school and a JC, right? The MOE gives you that subsidy for your school fees. When you look at the breakdown of your bills and everything, right? Okay, you understand the difference between the two. Can you see the difference, right? Okay, yeah, right? So that is how we understand the difference between the two. Defense, right? I cannot say, I'm sorry, you are kind of richer, please go and find your way to defend yourself, right? And have your own military and so on. It doesn't work like that, right? But things like welfare benefits are targeted at certain parts of society, and they deliberately take money from one group of society to fund the welfare policy. We clear on this one? Okay, right, okay, can. Okay. Last one, which is sorry, hold on, yeah, hold on. Last one, which is macroeconomic stabilization. Right, basically that is to address stabilization or quick growth, within the economy as a result of, say, for example, if an economy has experienced a crisis, an economic crisis, or it has experienced, say, for example, say like now, the pandemic and how it has created a dent in the economy, right? So in this case, right, there would be demand side reforms and supply side reforms. So look at the current effect of the pandemic on the economy. What has it done? It has created a scenario where several individuals have been retrenched, right? People have lost their jobs and so on. So when people have lost their jobs as a result of a dent in the economy, right? What then should government do in order to address this concern? Okay, let's look at Singapore government, right? What has been the refrain, right? That Singapore government has constantly made reference to in terms of helping workers. What have they basically been talking about? What kind of policies have they been trying to push forward? And what have they been encouraging? Huh? Reskilling, upgrading, skills upgrading, right? They're encouraging, what else are they encouraging? They're encouraging people to look at different industries. Like, say, for example, you have a big focus on, say, what's that called? The early childhood industry, right? Teaching. When they talk about mid-career switches, you can, and then you have your what's that thing called? When they give you that money for you to go and the skills future, right? They give you the allowances. You can go and upgrade yourself. Go for courses and things like that, right? So that's basically what the logic behind macroeconomic stabilization is. You have a kink, right, in the economy as a result of some exogenous factors. Remember this word, exogenous factors, right? Crisis, external, external events, right? Like, so for example, domino effect of an economic crisis, or the effect that economies are currently facing as a result of the pandemic, right? And therefore, in order to stabilize the economy, right, you have things like people are demanding, right? Okay, be small and medium enterprises today, right? Taxi drivers, SMEs, right? Your Grab drivers, for instance, right? Your food delivery drivers and all. What are they all complaining about? What they're griping about? Staying afloat, correct, in the economy, right? So they're asking for tax breaks. They're asking for unemployment benefits. These small medium enterprises or small businesses are asking, please give us a waiver in terms of the rentals and so on. Appealing to the landlords and such, right? And they're getting assistance from government. So that is your demand side reforms. Supply side reforms is like what you all referred to earlier on, like your skills upgrading or anything related to funding, skills upgrading, funding, further education, funding training, and so on. We understand the difference between the three types of spending. Okay, so the focus, right, really would be on, right, on the idea of redistribution, right? That's basically what we want to pay attention to, and allocation in particular. We're going to look at the difference between the two. Mental health care. That is a difficult question for me to answer at this point, right? Because all of us have the same question also. Why is it not targeted? It would technically, I would think, come under healthcare, right? But it is something that maybe they find it difficult to diagnose, or it is the logic behind welfare benefits and unemployment benefits and pensions, right? All of these kinds of redistributive policies, right? Why do you think, right, it's not accessible to everyone, and it's not very easily accessible? Like, if you want to apply for these kinds of things, you have to submit documents, you have to subject yourself to tests and so on, right? Because there's this scenario where some people may take advantage of these structures in society, right? And let's be very honest, to all income taxpayers, right? Are they happy about being the loser in this scenario and funding, another group of society? While we understand, from an outsider perspective, that means from an academic perspective or a holistic perspective, that paying taxes, right, which is an immediate dent on your disposable income, right, is actually in the long run going to level up the entire society and create benefits, right? But in the short run, people are always not happy, right? Like, hey, my disposable income is shortchanged because it goes to CPF, it goes to paying to Sinda and Mendaki and all of these other things, right? So people always grumble about these kinds of things, right? So, but I mean, that question that you have, it's a valid question, but it's not entirely part of this discussion, right? So I'm going to sidestep that a little bit and move on to the next discussion, okay? All right. Otherwise, I will never finish. Right. Almost finishing. All right. Okay. Let's look at this part here. All right. Okay. So when we look at this particular slide on the cake, right? Okay, what we want to understand is that when you talk about redistribution, right? Is it a scenario where all the slices of the cake, are they going to be equal or not? That's the main question. Is it divided equally for everybody? And the answer really is no, right? Okay, because in some cases redistribution can actually result in less beneficial policies. You really have to examine it on a case by case basis, in a nuanced perspective, because it really depends on the policy position, right? So when you say, oh, redistribution, you've got welfare policies, right? Does welfare policies, right, really benefit all of those who are in the lower strata of the, lower level of the income strata? Does it necessarily lift up all of these people also? Right? Does it automatically say that everybody who's below this particular income line, right, is going to get all of these kinds of benefits, and they're going to level up with everybody else? Not necessarily, right? It really depends on the political system. It really depends on the political party who is the beneficiary of these policies, right? In some of these economies, right, or in some of these societies, you find that those that are sort of caught in the middle, in Singapore, I think they like to use this phrase sandwich generation. Have you heard of this phrase, the sandwich generation, right? So you are neither, you're technically like not really middle class, you're not really like in the lower strata either, you're sort of caught in between, but you're also struggling. But these groups sort of tend to get excluded from the criterion to qualify for these welfare policies as well, right? So depending, right, on how these policies, conduct redistribution, right, you can actually have varying levels of benefits accorded to society, right? The who benefits, right, and who loses is actually very important, right? So when we say, the less fortunate, right, who actually constitutes the less fortunate, right? Who actually constitutes the poor? Are we talking about people who are living under $1 a day, right, who are below the poverty line? Or are we talking about those who are struggling, who are in the middle income bracket as well, right? So that is something that we need to think about also, right? And also we need to think about, at the end of the day, what is the objective of the government of the day, right? Are they looking at long-term development? Are they looking to enhance the employability of the aging demographic, right? And so let's say, like, for example, in societies like Singapore and Japan, right? In societies like Singapore and Japan in particular, with very large aging populations, right? Who are they focusing on? The focus, is it on ensuring that they level up, right, the ability of the aging population to continuously get re-employed? Look at the policies associated with re-employment in Singapore. From over to say, for example, the last 20 years, right? Slowly, the retirement age and re-employment age has been raised slowly, right? And now you've come to a point where they're looking at a higher age where they want to re-employ, right? So that is the issue down here, right? What is it that they're looking at? What are the intense cleavages in society? Is it a majority? What is the majority cleavage, right? Is it age? Is it a particular economic group, socioeconomic class, right? Is it a particular ethnic group? Is it a religious group, right? Who constitutes government? How are they responding, right? And that is why you will notice, right, that there's no one particular kind of redistributive policy that we can apply to all states, right? Well, why is it that some states are welfare states? Why is it that Singapore is not a welfare state? Despite, right, the fact that if you look at the Gini coefficient, you know what Gini coefficient is? Gini, Gini. We'll look at it next week, right? But since I'm talking about it, might as well just say we talk about welfare, right? Gini coefficient, right, is index that measures income inequality, right? The higher the number, the more inequality that exists in society, right? And Singapore has been hovering around 0.3 something to 0.4 something. It was 0.415 or 416 a couple of years ago. It has gone down slowly in the last maybe 2 to 3 years or so, right? But anything that is closer to 0.4 is considered to be very high levels of income inequality, right? And we are kind of at the borderline there, right? But government has been emphasizing that there's an attempt to bring it down, right? So if that's the case, right, if redistribution works well like this, then we would not have income inequalities existing in societies, right? So that is what we need to think about, right? When we look at efficient allocation, the difference is that we are attempting to increase the amount of benefits for whole of society. That's why we looked at the logic of, remember I mentioned just now, say the subsidies that are available to you via public healthcare or via public education, like everybody, regardless of what income bracket you belong to, you're automatically entitled to the government MOE subsidy when it comes to basic education, right? If you enroll in a public institution, if you're a Singapore citizen, and so on, right? So that is the difference, when we talk about the logic of redistribution and efficient allocation. What are the outcomes that they're trying to create in society? Okay? Okay, still got time. All right. Okay, so, right, this is what we need to pay attention to, right? Remember, I asked you to hold on to the idea of the, different types of policies relating to, redistribution and allocation, right? So the logic here is that we cannot assume, right, that all kinds of economic policies will automatically produce winners or losers, right? So the logic is that, it's not so much of a zero-sum understanding. It's not so clear, right, that we are thinking about policies that are either redistributive or they are purely efficient, right? Okay, they are purely, looking at, allocation. So when we look at the two extremes in red, right? Purely redistributive, right? And then purely efficient. Maybe you want to indicate that so you don't get confused, right? When you say purely efficient, means we're talking about allocation, right? Allocative policies. Purely efficient, we're referring to allocative policies, right? Okay. All right. So, there are different, types. It is nuanced, right? It is best to understand it again on a continuum because you've got policies that can be somewhat a combination, right, of distributive and somewhat efficient, right? And then they can be leaning more to efficiency or they can be leaning more towards redistribution. It really depends on the type of policies. That's why we have categorized them, right, accordingly. You understand? Can you see on the spectrum? We will revisit this, right, in the next lecture as well, right? We will come back to this again, right? But when you look at, purely redistributive, if it's purely redistributive, that means you are purely looking at taking from one group and redistributing to another group. You're creating winners and losers, like welfare benefits. If you look at industrial subsidies, how is that taking from one group and benefiting another group? You're taking government revenue, right, that arises from, say, income tax and several other sources of revenue, and you are particularly giving it only to one particular constituent or one particular group, which is a particular industry. Say, like, for example, remember we looked at different kinds of interest groups, fighting for subsidies under the interest group chapter, and we talked about the farming subsidies, right? At the end of the day, who's the one that benefits mainly from the farming subsidies? Farmers or the farming industry, correct? So it is specific to one particular category, right? So that is where you get a winner and a loser. In this case, that particular industry that benefits from that subsidy, right, is the winner. Those that contributed to the subsidies via taxes technically would be the losers, right? So can you see how your industrial subsidies or your welfare benefits, right, are purely redistributed because you are creating a winner and a loser. It's an intentional outcome that you are creating, okay, right? Say, like, for example, the rental subsidies for the SMEs, right? It directly impacts the SME per se. It may in some way impact the consumer because if the SME is unable to pay the rent, right, and that means their costs increase. If their costs increase, and then who bears the cost? It sort of in some way is translated to the consumer, right? But the main benefit is enjoyed by the particular industry that is getting the subsidy to start off with, right? They need not necessarily, just because they get a subsidy, right, it doesn't mean that they need to pass on that saving to you either, right? I'm pointing this out because I know there'll be somebody who asks this question, or indirectly, it will translate into cost, right? So before you ask me that question, I already addressed it down here already, okay? Then you've got things like public healthcare or labor market rules, right, that can be somewhat redistributive or somewhat efficient, like what EAT kind of targeted on earlier on, right? When you talk about public healthcare, right, it is more redistributive then it is efficient, right? Because particular groups of people, tend to, maybe take advantage of this a little bit more. So maybe if you are from a particular age group, like the elderly, right, you will be able to take advantage of, the public healthcare policies a little bit more. If you, okay, say for example, if you are an older generation civil servant, right? So maybe your parents' generation, right? Okay, if they are a civil servant, they would probably enjoy higher level of medical benefits than today's generation of civil servants, right? Say like my dad, has got because he was from the military, right? He has got a better pension program and a better they use that civil service card, to enjoy the subsidies and so on, right? In comparison, to the younger generation, with benefits are slightly, lesser, right? Because the schemes have changed and so on, right? So that's where you get the nuance from. You understand the difference between the few, right? When we look at the continuum, right? And then on the extreme, on the other hand, right? Things like, say, for example, environmental standards, right? They can be somewhat, redistributive, right? And they are somewhat efficient. It's more inclined, it's like sort of straddling in between, right? And then you've got free trade, which is basically purely efficient, right? Because free trade is intended to benefit everyone, basically, right? Because free trade means reduction of barriers to entry, reduction of tariffs, reduction of quotas, and so on. And that is supposed to increase the variety of products available to people, right? And that would mean that the higher number of products you have, right? This is basic economics, right? The higher number of products that are supplied, right? That are supplied and available to you, the lower the prices are, but higher quality of products, right? Because I've got so many to choose from. Like you go to the supermarket, right? You've got like 20 brands of jam or 20 brands of peanut butter to choose from, right? And they are all competitive because they are attracting the consumer to buy, right? So prices tend to go down, but quality goes up, variety increases, right? So that is something that benefits everybody. Can you see how the policies are different and create different kinds of outcomes? Right? Okay, simple, right? Actually, right? You look, if you just look at the individual things and you're like, oh my god, what do these terms actually mean, right? But when you break it down, it's easy to understand actually. All right, okay, all right, yeah, okay. So these are the explanations, right, that you can basically look at, right? I've expanded it for you, right? Okay, in this graphic now. Yep. Okay. Okay, let's look at this one down here. What time is it? Forgot time. All right. Let's look at this point down here, right? Okay, there are 4 different key indicators of economic performance. Okay, all right, these are the main ones that you need to focus on. I think everybody understands what they mean. In the exam, right? If you're writing an exam answer, and the question is on, how does economic performance vary between democracies and non-democracies, or how economic performance varies within democracies. Notice the phrasing is between democracy and non-democracy, and the other phrase is within democracies. All right, you understand the difference between the two. I point this out right now because I'm going to be repeatedly saying this. All right, so I do not want you to be confused, right, as to what I'm referring to. Okay, all right. In the final exam, right, if you're writing a question, right, related to patterns of economic performance, right, there should be a brief paragraph that summarizes these points on this slide down here. That means before you, please don't do this, jump into the exam answer. It says, say economic performance, economic performance, economic performance throughout the entire paper without defining, explaining what is economic performance, right? A lot of students do this. All right, they just mentioned what is economic performance. How do I arrive at understanding how is economic performance measured? So you have to indicate, right, that there are 4 key indicators. Don't have to write long story relating to this. Maybe like 3 to 4 lines, just a very short paragraph, right? These are the 4 major indicators of economic performance, in democracies and non-democracies, or in economies, right? Just basically just highlight that. And have a quick explanation. It refers to GDP, right, which is about how fast the amount of resources that are created in a society grows year to year, right? Because GDP technically measured, in a yearly manner, or they look at it, biannually or quarterly, right? Like quarterly forecast for GDP growth and so on, right? Then you've got unemployment rates, right? So what proportion of the workforce is employed. This one is related to things like labor. Remember we talked about labor market protection regulation, right? Okay, so if you've got a very high level of hey, it's going green, in my face. Okay, the higher level of the workforce that is unemployed, particularly after an economic crisis, right? That refers to macroeconomic stabilization, or that refers to labor regulations that have been implemented or not, right? If you look at inflation rates, what do inflation rates refer to? When inflation rates go up, what happens? If you've got higher levels of inflation, what happens? Huh? Prices of goods go up. Things become more expensive, right? And then what happens? So what if prices of goods go up? Reduce spending because things are expensive, right? That impacts on the standard of living, right? And then people have got less. This is like economics. The people have got less disposable income, right? Because they spend so much money, right? Okay, it affects, yeah, correct. Rate, it affects purchasing power, right? And then what also, and if you've got, if it, sorry, what am I saying? If it affects purchasing power, right? If you have to spend more money, then that affects savings. If it affects savings, then what do people tend to become more reliant on? Public goods and services. Can you see the connection? Right, okay. So this is why this is an indicator of economic performance, right? And how, this is an indicator of how government spends money, correct? Can you see the connection? That is why you need to think about things, in this a domino effect style, right? Okay. And then you've got gross public debt, right? How much money a central government owes, right? So in some countries you've got very high public debt. In some countries public debt is, better controlled, right? We'll come back to all of we will come back, right, to all of these ideas, right, when we look at the different indicators subsequently. Okay? All right? Are we clear on all of this now, first, for now? Because if you don't understand this, right, then, the subsequent arguments become difficult to explain. That is why I tell you that you need to explain this first, because these are all subsequently referred to. Remember just now I showed you that slide 19 and the different points that you need to explain, right? They are directly related, particularly, right, to the arguments you need to make when you want to explain how economic performance and public spending differs within democracies. This one is particularly important because in that argument there, right, we refer to things like varieties of capitalism, we refer to institutional design and public debt, we refer to prices and inflation and so on. So these points, if you don't mention this and don't explain this in the beginning of your exam answer, how are you going to explain why these points are important when you're examining the different arguments, right, under explaining why public spending and economic performance, right, is different in different types of democracy? Okay, so that is why this is important. If you skip this point, right, it's not to say that you will fail, right? Okay, it's not, you will not fail, right? Because you're still explaining the ideas in your exam answer. But a marker who is looking out for these kinds of things, right, would probably dock a couple of marks and say you didn't explain what economic performance actually is, and that concept is central to the entire argument, right? Okay, so you may not get such an excellent grade, right, because your discussion is not as comprehensive as it is supposed to be. Are we clear on this? All right, so please, I remind students, I'm sorry I nag about these kinds of things a little bit, right? Because I remind students, as many times as I can. And then when I look at, the prelim papers, I look at, practice papers, right? I see these important definitions and explanatory elements, right, missing from the answer, which detracts from the quality of the answer. It's not because we want to be fussy, right? But it's because it contributes to the overall, explanation. And it also is a reminder to the marker that you as a student, right, understand all of these concepts very well and can piece them together. Understand? Okay? All right. Okay, let me run through this idea of the political factors and non-political factors, right? And then y'all can go for the lunch break. Okay, all right. Okay, so look at these different kinds of non-political factors, right? Okay, so when we say non-political factors, the idea behind these, right, is to basically say that it is not directly. Maybe you want to write this down. It is not directly a result of engineering by the government. That's basically why they refer to it as non-political, right? Because it is something that is maybe out of control of the hands of government directly, right? It is impacted by exogenous factors as well, right? It's impacted by developments, right, in a in an international economy or a global economy, right? Okay, so while this is understandable, okay, if you look at things like level of natural resources, can you control the level of natural resources a state has? No, right? You can't control that. Like Singapore has no natural resources. I cannot say please develop iron ore so that I can dig it up and export, right? You can't do that, right? So the rationale is that level of natural resources is something that is a bit out of control, right? Whether you have it or not is something that is a natural given, right? Level of economic development also is impacted by external forces. It's not entirely in the hands of a state, right? I'm going to come back and debunk some of these things, right? Okay, but think about it. Say for example, you can manage your economy extremely well. Singapore, right? If you look at 1997 Asian financial crisis, right? Prior to that, right? Singapore from 1965, from the advent of independence, right? Okay, you have had a government that has paid very keen attention, right, to the development of the economy to the point where they even, had a very large interventionist approach, right? This is what we call the developmental state model. This government identified niche industries, they pumped in money, right? They bought up land, they developed the economy. They didn't allow it to, resort to things like, import substitution or export oriented policies per se, and it wasn't a case where they left the invisible hand of the market to regulate everything, right? There was a very strong interventionist bane to it, but still, right, despite this very tight economic management, you still had the fallout and the backlash experienced as a result of the 1997 Asian financial crisis, right? No matter how well put together the economy was, they still experienced the backlash. No matter how well put together the economy is today, COVID-19 pandemic, we're still experiencing economic backlash, right, as a result of it. Amount of human capital, can we adjust that also? Right, that's the number of people who are in the labor force, because that is the number of people who have been born, educated, and entering into the labor force in that particular year, right? So that is also something that is not entirely up to the hands of government either. Level of technological development also depends on the level of ability to purchase technology, to implement it, to use it, right, and so on. Degree of free trade depends on the international economy. Ask you this question: can we flip any of these arguments on its head and say, no, it can be subjected to so it can be subjected to political policies and political engineering? Can we flip any of these arguments on its head and say, yeah, we can actually change it to become a political factor? Anyone? Degree of free trade? How? How? Any others from people here? Any others? Okay. Yeah, go ahead. Explain what. Okay, fine. Yep. Yeah, and how they utilize it, for what purposes also, right? Trade war between government meaning what? Trade war between government meaning what? That one is related to which one? Level of economic development or degree of free trade? Degree of free trade relating to things like maybe bilateral agreements, and so on. Yeah. Common economy and markets. Okay, fine. All right. Okay. What else? Only that. Natural resources. Yeah. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah, but that's illegal. Right. Okay. Okay. Let's go. Let's do another. Let's take another approach to the level of natural resources, right? We can also think about a political angle to level of natural resources in terms of management of the sale revenue that comes as a result of natural resources as well, right? We can think about that, right? Okay, all right. So how well you take advantage of the level of natural resources. Okay, yeah, which I'll come to later when we talk about the resource curse. All right, okay, we'll look at that. Nicholas, yes, that was exactly what I was talking about. Amount of human capital. Look at what Singapore has done. We only have a particular, we have like a not a fantastic birth, what's that? Birth rate, right? And then so the replacement, of peoples, right? We have an aging population, right? And so what have we done? We have looked towards embracing foreign talent, right? And we say we have an open foreign talent policy because we need to inject more talent and more numbers, right, into the economy, so into the labor market, right? So that is something that can be adjusted as well. So that's why I asked the question: are they really truly non-political, or can it be turned into political factors? Why I point this out, right, is that sometimes we have a very black and white understanding of certain factors. We need to think about these kinds of things, a little bit, more in a little bit more in a nuanced manner, right? You look at it, and we think that, oh, this is something that cannot be controlled or cannot be adjusted, but it can be adjusted. It can be subject to political engineering, right, to create particular outcomes, right? And it depends, and that would then directly impact on how much money government is spending, how much money government is redistributing to society, right? Say, for example, the level of natural resources, how they manage it, right? And if you look at the resource curse, right, and how economic mismanagement related to the sales of these revenues, right? And how they then, if you're sitting on a nest egg of oil, right, are you going to be working as hard as a state without natural resources? Not necessarily, right? Especially if you're, the type of government that is intent on, rent seeking, right, or rentiers, if you look at later, or kleptocratic in nature, you are attempting to steal off all these resources and line your own pockets instead of redistributing back into society. That would basically impact on how that affects, say, for example, inflation, how that affects the ability of people to buy goods and services, how it affects things like public health care, provision of public goods and services, and so on. So that is why, right, I wanted to point this out to you, right, that it can actually be political in nature as well, right? Don't always take things at face value. Think a little bit about more of these things, in a more nuanced manner. Okay, all right. Okay, so these are the non-political factors, right? And then what we want to look at here, right, is give me 2 minutes, okay. All right, is that the main questions that we want to ask now here, right? The main question we want to ask is: do democracies, right, have better levels of economic performance as opposed to non-democracies, right? Do we see better economic performance, right, coming out of democracies as opposed to non-democracies? And that question basically focuses on whether you're a democracy or a non-democracy. That has got direct correlation to how the economy performs. Okay, that means we are talking about the impact. Maybe you want to write this down, all right? The impact of the design of government on economic performance. That's basically what that statement is telling you. If you see this question in the exam, right, that's what you need to interpret it or understand it as. Same thing, right? Do some types of democracies have better levels of economic performance than other types of democracies? Again, it comes to the same point, right? The design of that particular democracy, whether it is parliamentary or presidential, whether it is, a majoritarian consensus style, right? That particular design, does that impact on economic performance, right, in comparison to others? So it is the impact of the design, okay? The types of institutions that exist within that system how is that related to economic performance? And how, when we say how is that related to economic performance, means how does it affect, that means how does design affect GDP growth? How does design affect unemployment rates? How does the design affect inflation and subsequently affect prices? How does design affect public debt, which means how does it affect how much money government spends? Correct? Can you see? Can you see the connection? Okay? All right? Okay. Let's do this. Okay, these ones I just highlighted to you, certain political factors, right? Okay, that would affect the way that is part of the designs, right? So political party is part of the design. Whether you have large political parties, small political parties, whether you have political parties that are electorally significant or electorally insignificant in a majoritarian electoral system. Small political parties are electorally significant or not electorally significant. Small political parties in a majoritarian system. No. Why? Because majoritarian electoral systems, right? They favor two-party system, large political parties, right? You often end up with a single party government, correct? Correct. All right. Okay. In a PR system, right, the smaller political parties are electorally significant, correct? And because it tends to result in a what type of government? Coalition government, right? Which is more representative, right? Okay. Now you know why I said those chapters are important, because you need to zoom in. If you cannot zoom in and it's not at your fingertips, right, you will not be able to make the connection, or you cannot see the connection. Can you see why I said those were important, right? Okay, type of government, whether it's authoritarian, autocratic, or democratic, right, can impact, right? Things like, say, for example, inclusiveness of government also, right? Whether it allows participation in formulating, implementing various policies. Is government interested in engaging businesses in consultation? Is government interested in listening to the grievances of individuals, right? If in the case of, say, for example, PR system, it is more representative. So the views of the individuals, right, is taken more closely into consideration, because the various political parties within the coalition are intending to respond to all of the people who voted for them. So it is more representative. The higher the level of representation, the higher the level of inclusiveness. Is it not correct? Can you see the connection? Right? When you talk about things like stability, which types of government which type of government design is considered to be more stable? Which type of government design is considered to be more stable? Single party or coalition? Single party, right? They tend to be in power for longer periods of time, right? Majority governments tend to be more stable as opposed to coalition governments or minority governments. Remember, we discussed all of this a couple of lectures ago, right? Okay. If you look at things like exogenous factors, right, like economic crisis, recession, political climate, and so on, right, this is also a political factor. Why? Because it depends on how government responds to this economic crisis and recession. Government can just say, sorry, I cannot do anything, right? Economic recession is there and I cannot inject any more money. But what did Singapore government do? All right, okay, I'm sorry, I'm just using Singapore government as a reference, right? Because it's been in the news, right? But what did Singapore government do in the last two budgets? The next budget for this year's upcoming, right? But what did they do in the last two budgets as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic? Especially in the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic. What did they do? Stimulus package. They dipped into the reserves, right? They justified why they dipped into the reserves and so on, right? Some other governments would say, sorry, everybody just got to bite the bullet, too bad. right? And you've got to live with, look at the way stimulus packages look like in the US, and people were looking at stimulus checks, right? Versus how stimulus packages look like elsewhere in other European countries or other Southeast Asian countries and so on. So still, it has to do with how government responds, right, to these economic crises and so on. So so these become political factors. You understand? You understand how each of these factors, we understand them and interpret them. Are we clear on this? Everybody clear? Any questions? All okay? Okay. All right. Okay. Okay. Let's do this. This one I will go through very quickly subsequently. All right, because this is just to point out certain patterns, right? Not directly relevant to the discussion. So I'll run through very quickly. Let's do this. What is the time? I'll take it as 1:15. Come back 1:30. All right. Okay. Go. Come back after the break. Come back at 1:15. Sorry. Come back at 1:30. Sorry. What am I saying?